the 17th of January, 1945. The Colmar Pocket, Alsace-Lorraine. The snow fell in thick, drowning curtains across the eastern hills of France, muffling the world beneath a blanket of white silence. In the frozen woods near the village of Holtzwihr, the ground was no longer earth, it was iron. The trees stood like skeletal witnesses, their branches weighted with ice that cracked and sang in the wind. Beneath them, the snow was not pristine. It was churned into slush by boots and treads, stained pink and brown where men had fallen and been dragged away. The air tasted of cordite and pine sap, and the cold was so absolute that breath turned to frost before it left a man's lips. The temperature had dropped to 15 degrees Fahrenheit. Weapons froze. Fingers went numb inside gloves. And in this frozen hell, the 3rd Infantry Division was ordered to take ground. The Germans had no intention of giving up. The Colmar Pocket was a bulge in the Allied line, a stubborn German holdout west of the Rhine that threatened the entire Alsatian front. For weeks, American and French forces had battered against it, bleeding into the snow for every yard gained. The Germans were dug in deep veteran troops, hardened by years of war, supported by machine gun nests, mortars, and the kind of defensive positions that turned infantry advances into slaughter. They had mined the roads, zeroed their artillery on every approach, and transformed the forests and fields into interlocking kill zones. The Americans knew what awaited them. They had seen it before, in the Vosges, at Anzio, in 100 other places, where the earth drank blood and gave nothing back. But orders were orders, and the 3rd Division moved forward. Among them was a young 2nd lieutenant, 20 years old, with a face that still carried the softness of youth beneath the grime and exhaustion. His name was Audie Murphy. He stood 5 feet 5 inches tall and weighed 112 pounds soaking wet. He looked like a boy playing soldier, someone who should have been finishing high school or working a farm back in Texas, not leading a platoon through frozen woods where every shadow could conceal a sniper. But those who served with him knew better. Murphy had already seen more combat than men twice his age. He had fought his way up the Italian peninsula, bled in the invasion of southern France, earned a field commission for his actions at the quarry in the Vosges Mountains. He carried himself with a quiet, almost eerie calm under fire, the kind of stillness that unsettled even veteran sergeants. His eyes were pale and distant, as if he were always looking at something just beyond the horizon, something the rest of them couldn't see. On that frozen morning, Murphy's company was ordered to advance across an open field toward a tree line held by German forces. Intelligence reported machine gun positions, dug-in infantry, possibly armor support. It was the kind of mission that looked simple on a map and catastrophic on the ground. The field was roughly 400 yards of snow-covered nothing, no cover, no concealment, just open space where men became targets the moment they stepped into it. The tree line beyond was dark and silent, a wall of pines and shadows that could hide an entire battalion. Murphy studied it through binoculars, noting the slight irregularities in the snow, the faint discolorations that might indicate foxholes or gun emplacements. He didn't need to tell his men what they already knew. This was going to be bad. They moved out at dawn, when the light was still grey and uncertain, hoping the dimness might buy them a few precious seconds before the Germans opened up. The snow crunched beneath their boots, each step sinking ankle-deep into the drifts. The weight of their gear, rifles, ammunition, grenades, rations pressed down on shoulders already aching from weeks of continuous combat. Murphy moved with his platoon, positioned near the front, his carbine held low and ready. The air was so cold it burned in their lungs. No one spoke. The only sounds were the crunch of snow, the rasp of breath, and the distant rumble of artillery from some other sector of the line. They were halfway across the field when the first machine gun opened fire. The sound was a zipper being torn open, a mechanical scream that shattered the morning silence. Tracers cut through the grey light, bright red lines that seemed to hang in the air for an impossible second before they found flesh. Men went down immediately, crumpling into the snow without a sound, or screaming as rounds punched through legs, chests, bellies. Murphy dropped flat, his face pressed into the snow, feeling the impact of bullets slamming into the ground inches from his head. The snow erupted in little geysers all around him, dirt and ice spraying into the air. More machine guns joined in, firing from multiple positions along the tree line, overlapping fields of fire that turned the open field into a killing ground. Mortar rounds began to fall, tearing craters in the snow, shrapnel whining through the air like furious insects. Murphy's radio operator, a kid from Ohio whose name was Latty Tipton, crawled up beside him, shouting something over the noise. Murphy couldn't hear him. He grabbed the handset and tried to call for artillery support. But the radio was dead, either damaged by shrapnel or frozen solid by the cold. Tipton was hit a moment later, a burst of machine gun fire that stitched across his back and threw him forward into the snow. Murphy grabbed him, pulled him close, but Tipton's eyes were already glazing over, his breath coming in wet, rattling gasps. He died there in Murphy's arms, blood soaking into the white snow, turning it black. The platoon was pinned down, immobile, men hugging the ground and praying the next burst wouldn't find them. They couldn't advance, and they couldn't retreat. Both directions were equally lethal. Murphy looked back toward the American lines, where the rest of the company was supposed to be supporting them, but he saw only a few scattered figures, most of them already hit or diving for cover. They were on their own. The Germans had them zeroed in, and every second they stayed in the open was another second closer to annihilation. Murphy made a decision. He rose to a crouch, ignoring the bullets cutting the air around him, and began moving forward, toward the tree line, toward the machine guns that were killing his men. It was insane. It was suicidal. It was the only option that made any sense. If they stayed where they were, they would all die. If they retreated, the mission failed, and they would be ordered to do it again tomorrow, with fewer men and the same result. The only way out was through. He moved in short, fast bursts, using the folds in the terrain, slight depressions in the snow, the crater left by a mortar round as momentary cover. His carbine was up and firing, aimed at the muzzle flashes in the tree line. He didn't think. Thinking got you killed. He moved on instinct, on the muscle memory drilled into him by months of combat, his body operating independently of his mind. Behind him, a few men saw what he was doing and followed, crawling and running in short dashes, trying to keep up with their platoon leader, who seemed to have lost his mind. The first machine gun nest was dug into a shallow depression at the edge of the tree line, camouflaged with branches and snow. Murphy saw it only because he was close enough to see the barrel poking out, the faint shimmer of heat rising from the breach. He pulled a grenade from his belt, yanked the pin, counted 2 seconds, and threw it in a flat, hard arc. The explosion was muffled by the snow, but the machine gun went silent. Murphy was moving before the smoke cleared, charging the position, his carbine spitting fire. 2 Germans stumbled out of the nest, hands raised, faces black with powder burns. Murphy shot them both. There was no time for prisoners, no time for hesitation. This was kill or be killed, and the rules of civilized warfare had died somewhere back in the snow. He didn't stop. The second machine gun nest was 20 yards to the left, still firing into the field where the rest of his platoon was pinned down. Murphy could see the crew clearly now, 3 men, 1 feeding the belt, 1 firing, 1 scanning for targets. They hadn't seen him yet. He dropped to 1 knee, sighted carefully, and fired. The gunner's head snapped back, a spray of red mist hanging in the cold air. The loader grabbed for the weapon, trying to swing it around, but Murphy shot him through the chest. The third man tried to run. Murphy shot him in the back. It was then that the German counterattack hit. They came out of the woods in a rush, a squad of Wehrmacht infantry, supported by fire from positions deeper in the trees. Murphy saw them and turned, bringing his carbine up, but the weapon clicked empty. He dropped it and grabbed the fallen German's rifle, a Mauser K98, still warm from firing, and opened up on the advancing soldiers. He shot one, then another, working the bolt with mechanical precision, the rifle kicking hard against his shoulder. The Germans went to ground, firing back, and Murphy felt the first impact. The bullet hit him in the right hip, a white-hot spike of pain that knocked him sideways into the snow. He felt the wetness spreading down his leg, warm against the cold, but he stayed on his feet. He kept firing. Another bullet hit him in the left thigh, spinning him around, and he went down to one knee. The pain was distant now, something happening to someone else. He could feel his body shutting down, adrenaline and shock battling for control. A third bullet grazed his ribs, tearing through his jacket and leaving a burning line across his side. He ignored it. He kept shooting. The Germans were close now, close enough that he could see their faces, young men, frightened men, veterans who had fought from Stalingrad to Normandy and now found themselves in a frozen forest in France, facing a single American soldier who refused to die. Murphy dropped the Mauser and grabbed a fallen German submachine gun, an MP-40, and emptied the magazine into the advancing troops. Men fell, screaming, clutching at wounds, and the rest hesitated, confused by the ferocity of the resistance. That hesitation cost them. Murphy was hit again, a fourth bullet that punched through his left shoulder, and then a fifth that struck his right forearm, shattering bone. His arm went numb, useless, but he switched the MP-40 to his left hand and kept firing. A sixth bullet hit him in the abdomen, a low, tearing impact that doubled him over, and a seventh caught him high in the chest, missing his heart by inches. He collapsed into the snow, blood pouring from 7 separate wounds, his vision tunneling down to a narrow point of light. The Germans thought he was dead. They had to. No man could take 7 bullets and keep fighting. They began to advance again, moving cautiously toward the American lines, thinking the machine gun nests were secure, thinking the attack had been broken. They were wrong. Audie Murphy stood up. He didn't know how. Later, he wouldn't be able to explain it, even to himself. The pain was beyond description, a totality that consumed every nerve, every thought. His body was a broken machine, leaking blood into the snow, muscles torn, bones shattered. But something deeper than flesh and bone was still intact, some core of will, some refusal to accept the inevitable. He stood, swaying, his left hand clutching the MP-40, his right arm hanging limp at his side. His face was white as the snow around him, his lips blue with cold and blood loss, but his eyes were clear. The Germans saw him rise and froze, disbelief written across their faces. For a moment, the entire battlefield seemed to pause, as if the war itself had taken a breath. Then Murphy opened fire. He moved forward, not in a charge, but in a slow, relentless walk, firing the submachine gun in short, controlled bursts. The Germans scattered, some diving for cover, others turning to run. Murphy killed 3 more men, before the MP-40 ran dry. He dropped it and picked up another weapon, a Browning automatic rifle, left by a fallen American soldier, and continued his advance. The BAR roared in his hands, each shot a thunderclap in the frozen air. He was no longer thinking, no longer feeling. He was a force of nature, an embodiment of something the Germans had not anticipated and could not understand. The third machine gun nest was dug in behind a fallen log, the crew frantically trying to traverse their weapon to engage him. Murphy shot the gunner, then the loader, then a rifleman who popped up to throw a grenade. The grenade exploded behind him, the concussion knocking him forward, but he stayed on his feet. The fourth machine gun nest was the last, positioned in a shallow trench with good fields of fire. Murphy approached it from an angle, using the bodies of fallen Germans as cover, and when he was close enough, he pulled his last grenade, armed it, and threw it directly into the trench. The explosion silenced the gun. He stood there for a moment, alone in the snow, surrounded by the dead and dying, smoke rising from the destroyed positions. Blood dripped from his wounds, pattering into the snow like rain. His breath came in ragged gasps, each one sending fresh waves of agony through his shattered body. Behind him, he could hear the shouts of American soldiers, his men, finally advancing across the field now that the machine guns were silent. They found him there, still standing, still holding his weapon, his face expressionless. When the medics reached him, they couldn't believe he was alive. 7 bullet wounds, massive blood loss, likely internal injuries. Any one of the hits could have been fatal. Together, they should have killed him 3 times over. But Murphy walked to the aid station under his own power, refusing a stretcher, his jaw set in a hard line. He didn't say anything. What was there to say? The after-action reports documented what had happened, though the officers who compiled them struggled to believe their own words. Second Lieutenant Audie Murphy, acting alone after his unit was pinned down, had single-handedly assaulted and destroyed 4 German machine gun positions, killed an estimated 15 enemy soldiers, wounded dozens more, and broken the back of a German defensive line that had held for weeks. He had done this after being shot 7 times, any one of which should have incapacitated him. When asked later how he had managed it, Murphy shrugged. "I don't remember much," he said. "I just kept moving." The Germans who survived the engagement told a different story. They spoke in quiet voices, in prisoner of war camps and hospital wards, of the American who wouldn't die, the demon in the snow, who rose from the dead and kept coming. Some refused to believe it had been a single man. They insisted it must have been a squad, a platoon, an entire company. The alternative that one wounded soldier had shattered their defenses through sheer will was too incomprehensible, too demoralizing to accept. It violated everything they had been taught about combat, about the limits of human endurance, about the natural order of war. But the American soldiers who had been there, who had seen Murphy stand up with 7 bullets in him and walk into the teeth of German fire, they understood something different. They understood that they were witnessing something that transcended tactics or training. This was about belief, about what a man could do when he believed in something larger than himself. Audie Murphy had grown up in the desperate poverty of Depression-era Texas, one of 12 children in a sharecropper's family that barely survived from one season to the next. His father abandoned them. His mother died when he was 16. He had picked cotton for pennies a day, hunted squirrels and rabbits to keep his siblings from starving, and learned early that the world was a hard place that gave nothing for free. When the war came, he had tried to enlist in every branch of the service, desperate to escape the poverty that had defined his life, desperate to prove he was worth something. The Marines rejected him for being too short. The paratroopers turned him away for being underweight. The army finally took him, reluctantly, and assigned him to the infantry, the branch no one wanted, the branch with the highest casualty rates, the branch where skinny farm boys from Texas went to die. But Murphy didn't die. He fought across North Africa, Sicily, Italy, France, and Germany. And every time they told him he wouldn't survive, every time the odds said he should be dead, he kept going. Not because he was fearless, he suffered from nightmares and anxiety that would haunt him for the rest of his life, but because he had learned that survival was a choice, a decision you made every morning when you woke up. The poverty of his childhood had taught him that the world didn't care whether you lived or died, so you had to care. You had to fight. Not for glory or medals or recognition, but because fighting was all there was. The Germans he faced in the Colmar pocket had come from a different world. They had been raised in the rigid hierarchies of Prussian militarism, taught that obedience and discipline were the highest virtues, that the individual existed only to serve the state. They were excellent soldiers, technically proficient, tactically skilled, capable of extraordinary feats of endurance and courage when properly led. But they had also been taught that when the system failed, when the orders stopped making sense, when the leadership proved incompetent, there was nothing left but surrender. Their ideology gave them strength in victory, but offered no reserves for desperation. Murphy's ideology was different. It wasn't even conscious, wasn't something he could have articulated if asked. It was bone-deep, cellular, a product of a life spent fighting for survival in a country that promised opportunity to everyone and delivered it to almost no one. America had taught him that no one was coming to save you, that the cavalry wasn't real, that if you wanted something you had to take it yourself. This was the unspoken promise of American democracy, not equality or fairness or justice, but the brutal freedom to try, to fight, to fail, or succeed on your own terms. It was a harsh creed, unforgiving, often cruel. But it produced men who didn't know how to quit. The symbolic weight of that moment in the snow, of Murphy standing with 7 bullets in his body, became clear only later, as the war ground toward its conclusion and the world began to count the cost. The Germans had started the war, believing in their own superiority, in the inevitability of their victory, in the historical destiny of the Thousand-Year Reich. They had built their entire ideology on the premise that strength and will could overcome any obstacle, that the weak deserved to be conquered, that history belonged to those who seized it. And for a time, it had worked. They had conquered most of Europe, crushed armies, toppled governments, and seemed unstoppable. But they had miscalculated. They had confused brutality with strength, obedience with will. They had never understood that real strength wasn't about how hard you could hit, but how many times you could get hit and keep standing. They had never faced an enemy that refused to acknowledge defeat, that treated impossible odds as merely inconvenient, that drew strength not from ideology or nationalism, but from the simple, stubborn refusal to give up. Murphy, standing in the snow with his blood seeping into the frozen ground, was the embodiment of everything the Germans had failed to account for. He wasn't supposed to win. He was supposed to die. The fact that he didn't, that he stood up and kept fighting, was a refutation of everything they believed. In the weeks that followed, as Murphy recovered from his wounds slowly, painfully, in hospitals far from the front, the 3rd Infantry Division continued its advance. The Colmar pocket was eliminated. The Rhine was crossed. Germany collapsed. And in May 1945, the war in Europe ended. Murphy returned home to Texas with a chest full of medals, including the Medal of Honor for his actions at Holtzwihr. He was the most decorated American soldier of the war, a national hero, living proof of American courage and resilience. But the medals felt hollow to him. He carried the weight of the dead, the faces of the men he'd killed, and the men he'd failed to save. The nightmares never stopped. He would wake up screaming, drenched in sweat, back in the snow with the machine guns chattering and the bodies piling up around him. He self-medicated with alcohol and sleeping pills, fought depression, struggled to find a place in the post-war world that made sense. The same culture that had celebrated his heroism had no idea what to do with the broken man who came home wearing that hero's face. He eventually found work in Hollywood, trading on his fame to build a modest career as an actor, playing himself in the film adaptation of his memoir, To Hell and Back. The movie sanitized his experiences, turned them into entertainment, gave audiences a version of war they could digest without choking. Murphy played along, needing the money, needing the distraction, but he knew the truth. The real war, the one he'd lived through, couldn't be put on screen. It couldn't be explained or understood by people who hadn't been there. The moment in the snow, when he'd stood up with 7 bullets in him, wasn't heroic. It was necessary. And the fact that it had been necessary, that the world had required such things of him, was the true horror. The symbolic power of Murphy's story resonated through American culture for decades. It became a touchstone, a reference point, proof that Americans possessed some special quality that set them apart. Politicians invoked his name. Military academies studied his tactics. His story was told and retold, each version simplifying a little more, sanding down the sharp edges, turning a complex and traumatic experience into a clean narrative of triumph. The man himself, increasingly troubled, increasingly isolated, became secondary to the symbol he represented. But the symbol mattered. It mattered to the soldiers who came after him, in Korea and Vietnam and Iraq and Afghanistan, who faced their own impossible moments and drew strength from the knowledge that someone else had stood in the snow and refused to fall. It mattered to the civilians who needed to believe that when the worst happened, when everything went wrong, there were people who wouldn't break. And it mattered to America's enemies, who learned that the soft, wealthy, supposedly decadent Americans were capable of producing men who could take 7 bullets and keep fighting. The broader truth that Murphy's story illuminated was uncomfortable but undeniable. Democracy, for all its flaws and contradictions, produced a different kind of soldier than authoritarianism. The German soldier fought out of duty, discipline, and often fear. He was a cog in a machine, powerful when the machine functioned, helpless when it broke down. The American soldier fought out of something harder to define, a mix of individualism, stubbornness, and the deeply ingrained belief that he had the right to make his own choices, even in the face of death. This made American units harder to coordinate, more chaotic, less predictable. But it also meant that when the plan fell apart, when the officers were dead and the radios were broken and everything was going to hell, American soldiers didn't wait for orders. They improvised, they adapted, they kept fighting. This was the lesson of Holtzwihr. Not that Americans were better soldiers, German infantry was tactically superior in many ways, better trained, more experienced, more disciplined, but when the situation became truly desperate, when it came down to pure will and refusal to quit, the advantage shifted. Murphy's actions that day weren't about superior tactics or training, they were about refusing to accept reality, about looking at 7 bullets and a field of dead men and deciding that none of that mattered, that the only thing that mattered was the next step forward. The Germans who fought at Holtzwihr went home, those who survived, to a shattered country that had lost everything. They rebuilt, eventually, creating a new Germany, founded on different principles. Many of them spent the rest of their lives trying to understand what had happened, how they had lost, how the inevitable victory had turned into total defeat. Some of them remembered the American in the snow, the one who wouldn't die, and wondered if that had been the moment they should have known. If that single soldier, standing when he should have been dead, had been a preview of the inevitable outcome, one force that couldn't be defeated, meeting another that refused to accept defeat. The result had been foreordained. Audie Murphy died in 1971, in a plane crash in Virginia, at the age of 46. He was buried with full military honors at Arlington National Cemetery, his grave marked by a simple white headstone identical to thousands of others. Visitors still leave coins and flags there, still salute the stone, still tell the story of the soldier who was shot 7 times and stood up anyway. The story has become legend, the legend has become myth, and the myth obscures the man. But the truth remains, preserved in after-action reports and witness statements and the scars Murphy carried until the day he died. On a frozen morning in January 1945, a wounded soldier made a choice. He chose to stand when falling would have been easier. He chose to fight when surrender would have been rational. He chose to believe that one man could make a difference, even when all evidence suggested otherwise. And in that choice, in that moment, he embodied something essential about the American experiment, the idea that ordinary people, when pushed to the absolute limit, are capable of extraordinary things, not because they're stronger or smarter or braver than anyone else, but because they've been taught, rightly or wrongly, that they have the power to shape their own fate, that they don't need permission to act, that the only person who can decide when you're beaten is you. The snow continued to fall that day in Alsace-Lorraine, covering the blood and the bodies, smoothing the churned earth back into pristine white. The war moved on, as wars do, leaving its dead behind. But something had been proven in that frozen field, something that couldn't be buried or forgotten. 7 bullets had failed to stop one determined man. And if 7 bullets couldn't stop him, then perhaps nothing could stop what he represented. The stubborn, irrational, impossible belief that freedom meant fighting for yourself, standing on your own feet, and refusing to fall no matter how many times you were knocked down. That belief, more than any weapon or strategy, was what won the war. And it was paid for in blood, in nightmares, in the shattered lives of men like Audie Murphy, who gave everything and came home to find that everything wasn't enough. The price of that belief is still being paid, every day, by those who wear the uniform and face the test. They carry Murphy's legacy, whether they know his name or not. They carry the weight of that choice to stand when falling is easier, to fight when surrender is rational, to believe that one person can make a difference. The snow has long since melted from the fields of Holtzwihr. The machine gun nests are gone, ploughed under and forgotten. The men who fought there are mostly dead now, their stories fading into history. But the moment remains, frozen in time like the snow that covered it. 1 man, 7 bullets, and the choice to stand. That choice echoes still.